Good morning, everyone. I am very sorry that I cannot stay with you. As you know, I am in Dubai for COP28, invited by the Italian government, in particular, Extraordinary Commissioner for Sisma Earthquake 2016, for a presentation on inland areas and climate change, which I gave last night. Now I am at Dubai airport to return to Fiumicino. I am very grateful to Professor Ilian Noy and the Gran Sasso Science Institute, which allowed us to reach him. I would like to tell Ilian Noy that this school is very, very attentive to the themes of city design to increase its resilience to climate change and to perfect or slow down the timescales for change. I hope there will be other opportunity to meet Ilian Noy and the work together. Have a good work, and thank you very much to Ilian Noy for his presence.
Okay, thank you, Massimo. Now we are going to have a small introduction. So we are going to have a mix of the languages today, because we are going to talk in Italian. I'm going to introduce the event in Italian just to have a broader audience. But Ilan, of course, is going to speak in English because he can't speak Italian, unfortunately, yet. But maybe soon he's gonna speak in English. Sorry, Ilenia,
yeah, just a little. Just a few words to say thank you for coming here, for the contribution today. I'm here, Ilenia Pierantoni, a researcher here at the School of Architecture and Design, and here on behalf of Professor Sargolini, because as he mentioned, he is at the COP28. And I want to thank again for being here. I want to thank Marco Modica and Alessandra Fagian from Gran Sasso Science Institute for this opportunity to have this contribution today here. This event is part of the program for the celebrations of 30 years from the foundation of this school here in Ascoli Piceno. This school is part of the University of Camerino, which is one of the oldest universities in Italy. So we are very happy to have this important contribution, this excellence in this topic. And now I kindly ask you to Marco to introduce the topic and the event to the students, and have a good day.
Ok, grazie Ilenia, grazie a tutti per l'invito, anche a Massimo per ospitarci in questo evento abbastanza importante per la scuola di architettura. Io porto anche i saluti della rettrice, che mi ha detto espressamente di salutarvi, purtroppo non è potuta venire per motivi istituzionali, però porto i suoi saluti. Oggi noi abbiamo Ilian Noy che parlerà del rapporto tra disastri ed economia. Io dirò brevemente qualche parola per introdurre questo tema, perché è uno dei temi che noi un po' al Gran Sasso Science Institute analizziamo parecchio, un po' perché siamo nati in un certo senso dal terremoto, perché il nostro istituto è nato, il progetto del nostro istituto è nato a seguito del terremoto dell'Aquila del 2009. Siamo parte anche del consorzio REDI, che è un consorzio tra noi, l'Università di Camerino, l'INGV, l'INFN, che analizza appunto gli impatti dei disastri e prova a dare delle politiche o dei suggerimenti di politica per la ricostruzione, per i piani di mitigazione e prevenzione del rischio, e quindi siamo molto lieti di intervenire su queste tematiche. Ilan poi è uno dei massimi esperti, credo, di queste tematiche. Lui è un economista, il suo background è da economista, lavora e ha lavorato tantissimo sugli impatti economici dei disastri, diversi tipi di disastri, e siamo lieti di averlo da noi, perché inizierà a lavorare con noi al GSSI da gennaio 2024. oggi è qui più come visiting forse che come rappresentante del GSSI. Però quando si parla di queste tematiche un po' l'idea è che soprattutto per l'analisi di questi temi e degli impatti di disastri che possono essere naturali ma non sono solamente naturali, perché su questo tipo di tematiche rientrano anche quelli che vengono chiamati man-made disasters o anche aspetti come la guerra hanno delle caratteristiche simili a dei disastri. Rientrano in ballo molte tematiche. Si è sempre alla ricerca di studi che possono essere multidisciplinari, perché quando si cerca di analizzare il rischio di un determinato evento abbiamo due tipi di reami, di ambienti che interagiscono: l'ambiente umano, che è quello possiamo dire dell'economia, degli aspetti sociali e così via, e l'ambiente naturale, che è quello dell'effetto della natura, su cui l'uomo può intervenire parzialmente, soprattutto per prevenire e mitigare magari degli effetti indesiderati, però su alcuni aspetti come un terremoto difficilmente si può prevenire, si può fare mitigazione, si può costruire in maniera antisismica per esempio, però l'evento è la causa che poi può produrre un danno è difficilmente gestibile da parte dell'uomo. Quindi in alcuni lavori io spesso ho detto che l'uomo in un certo senso scommette con la natura, soprattutto quando decide di non intervenire e di non prevenire, di non mettere in atto politiche di mitigazione, perché quando si parla di eventi naturali estremi, eventi come il terremoto, climate change, che ha aumentato un po' queste probabilità del verificarsi di eventi. Comunque quando l'uomo non decide di non intervenire, decide di lasciare correre la natura, questa è una scommessa. Stiamo parlando di eventi a probabilità bassa, perché sono eventi che si ripetono con orizzonti temporali più o meno ampi, e quindi l'uomo in un certo senso sceglie di scommettere con la natura quando decide di non intervenire. In ogni caso, per ogni evento che si mette in atto, che nasce anche per casi sfortunati, si apre tutto un filone che è dedicato alla ricostruzione e al cosa fare quando l'evento influenza un territorio, un ambiente, una comunità. E in questi casi si parla appunto di politiche di ricostruzione. Ci sono state nel corso della storia, diverse filosofie di ricostruzione. Ad esempio l'Aquila si è puntato molto sul dovere e com'era, che è una politica che un po' viene contestata oggi, perché comunque si cerca di ricostruire meglio. Il tema di questo evento di Ilan sarà appunto il building back better, cioè ricostruire meglio di come era prima, perché l'evento che è sfortuito è dovuto alla sfortuna o comunque è dovuto a caratteristiche su cui l'uomo ha poca influenza, può essere motivo di opportunità, nel senso che una volta che si è verificato un danno, l'uomo ha l'obbligo anche morale di ricostruire in un modo che sia migliore di come era prima, cioè evitando i colli di programmando e progettando una ricostruzione più anche delle città, adeguandola ai nuovi bisogni che sono presenti sul territorio e che sono correnti e non passati, alle nuove caratteristiche che derivano da processi storici più o meno lunghi, e anche alle nuove tecnologie che sono presenti. Quindi il building back better è una delle caratteristiche più importanti su cui si può puntare una volta che deve ricostruire. Quindi a questo punto io forse lascerei la parola a Ilan. Ilan, I can leave you the floor to you, and Ilan, as I mentioned, is gonna talk in English. He's gonna move also a little bit. But of course, if you have questions, comments, don't be shy and feel free to ask and to raise all the comments that you have. So Ilan, thank you for being here in Ascoli.
First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much to GSSI for organizing this, and actually offering me a job that will start in January, to the university here. I saw that the university is from 1336. That's the oldest university I've ever spoken in, so it's an honor. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I was told, please give a talk, and I wasn't given any other instructions whatsoever. So I have a talk. It's not very technical, intentionally. Hopefully I will say something that is new to you, but if at any point you have any questions or you want to want to delve deeper into any of the points I'm raising, then by all means, please just let me know. Okay? Okay, so what I chose to speak about is long-term. What happens from an economic perspective, long-term, after a disaster. And a disaster can be, an earthquake, a terremoto, or it can be a volcanic eruption, or a big storm, or a flood, or whatever afflicts you. So in general, I'm trying to tease out some lessons from any type of disaster, right? And specifically, I want to focus on the long term. So when we think about disasters, we typically think about an event, a shock, that is triggered by a hazard, a natural hazard, and that can be any one of those events, and then that natural hazard intersects with something that is exposed to it, people, assets, buildings, infrastructure, roads, and those buildings or those people are vulnerable to the hazard, right? So I live in a city, or I lived up to recently in a city called Wellington in New Zealand, where we have wind that is very, very strong, right? So we have at least once a week 100-kilometer-an-hour winds. So our buildings are not vulnerable to 100-kilometer-an-hour winds. But in other places, of course, buildings are vulnerable, and if you have a storm that has 100-kilometer-an-hour winds, then you'll get a lot of damage. So it both the exposure to the hazard is important, but also the vulnerability, right? So in some places are more vulnerable than others, and some households are more vulnerable than others, some people are more vulnerable than others, and some infrastructure is more vulnerable than others. So anyway, that intersection of exposure, hazard, and vulnerability then leads to damages from those events. And those damages can be damages to assets, to buildings, to infrastructure, or it could also be damages to people. It could be mortality, it could be morbidity, it could be dislocation, and so forth. Okay? Now that damage, that stock of damage, then leads to reduction in economic activity, right? Because people have died, people have been injured, assets are no longer operating, electricity systems are not operating, and so forth. Then you start having reductions in economic activity. That's those indirect losses. And those indirect losses can last for quite a while, right? That depends on how long the process of reconstruction takes. And at the end of that process, once reconstruction ends, then you have the long-term new state, right? And the question I want to focus on in this conversation or in this lecture is, what is that end state? Where do we end up at the end of reconstruction? Now that reconstruction can last a few years, or it can last, like in L'Aquila, it probably last a few decades, right? Because if you've been to L'Aquila now, you know that reconstruction is still very much an ongoing process, even though the earthquake was 14 years ago. So how long that short term is, what's the duration of that short term is not clear, but what I mean by short term is that process in which the reconstruction still takes place. Okay? But I'm not focusing on that short term, I'm focusing here on the long term. And basically you can think of sort of 4 possible scenarios, right? On the upper left is you have a decline of economic activity, those indirect temporary losses, but you never recover from them. So your economy is always, afterwards, performs at a trajectory that is less than what it would have experienced without without the events, right? That's the upper left. The upper right is where there is a decline in economic activity, but there is a full recovery back to the trend. The lower left suggests a decline in economic activity, but then there is a boost because of all the spending on reconstruction. I think in L'Aquila you see this right now because there's so much spending on the reconstruction of the city that there is a temporary boom in economic activity, but then there is a decline back to trend. Or you can observe these scenarios where the process of reconstruction creates a city or a region or a country or even a neighborhood that is somehow more successful in some way, right? Now, obviously, in terms of policy, you want to aim to a specific type of scenario. So if you are starting with these indirect losses, you want to try and aim to make sure that you start to recover, right? And preferably even with that boost. And if you're lucky, you can even try to aim for that long-term recovery, right? If you are a policymaker or you are a decision maker in some sort, or if you are a planner or if you are an architect or whatever you're doing in the process of reconstruction, you ideally want to end up with this build back better. I'm not sure if there is an Italian equivalent to that expression.
Well, yes, but we are going to use also building back better.
Okay.
It's common knowledge.
It's okay. So the build back better, the origin of the term is after the tsunami in the South, in the Indian Ocean in 2004, where there was a lot of discussions on building back better after the tsunami in Aceh province in Indonesia, on the island of Sumatra that was heavily damaged by the event. And since then, the expression sort of received more and more attention. There was a big report on it in, I think, 2008 or something like that, trying to assess what happened in Indonesia. And then there was the big earthquake in Haiti in 2010, where that process really took off. And there was a lot of hope in Haiti at the time, because Haiti was such a unfortunate place before the earthquake, right? So before the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, Haiti was the poorest country in all of the Americas, and because they got a lot of attention for various reasons after the earthquake was horrific. About 1% of the population of the country died. And there was a lot of international goodwill and attempt to, and there was a hope that Haiti will emerge from this process with strengthened institutions, better economy, and so forth. If you know anything about the history of Haiti since then, you would know that that did not happen at all, and it's still the poorest country in the Americas, probably in a worse state now than it was before the earthquake. But Haiti is an easy example of why build back better sometimes doesn't work, and I can easily give a talk about why Haiti failed. The build back better in Haiti failed, but that's not the focus here. I'm going to give you another example, actually, one in which it was the success of this build back better scenario was much more possible, and that's Kobe in Japan after the earthquake in 1995. So Kobe had a very big earthquake in 1995. Kobe is a big city in Japan, about more than 1.5 million people, something like that in the city. It was one of the biggest ports in Japan, actually one of the biggest ports in the world. Hit by a big earthquake, 6,000 people died, so a very high mortality event and very high destruction. But it's Japan, it's a rich country, massive amount of resources. It's also a country where the social capital is really strong and the ability to mobilize resources for the public good is very, very strong. So they did a very, very quick recovery, right? So within 4 years, they've basically declared the reconstruction over. And if you come from L'Aquila, you appreciate that 4 years is quite an achievement for a level of destruction that is way, way, way better than any earthquake in Italy, at least in the last few centuries, I think. So a very 300,000 houses that were destroyed and so on. In 4 or 5 years, they finished reconstruction. Very good, and that the recovery was done very quickly, and I basically repeated what I told you right now. And then after the talk, somebody from the audience came to me and said, actually, my parents are from Kobe, and they still complain that the economy hasn't recovered 15 years later. And I was surprised because I've never heard that claim before, and there's some research, there are some economic papers that have said that the Kobe recovery was very, very good. Actually, one of them written by a Nobel Prize winner, so I said I trust the Nobel Prize winners. But after that comment, we said, okay, let's actually dig into the data and calculate who's right. Is this the Nobel Prize winner, or is this, that respondent from my talk? And this resulted in this paper, and actually what you see in this paper, it has a lot of colors. I'm colorblind, so I don't really know what the colors mean, but it's supposed to say that this is income per capita in the city of Kobe. So the whole map is the city of Kobe. It's the what they call the wards, the neighborhoods, or the I don't know how you call a sub area in a city, district in the city or whatever. So these are the different districts in the city of Kobe, and what happened to their income per capita in the 15 years following the earthquake. So what you see, I hope, if you see the colors, is that there is a decline in GDP per capita. Now this decline is relative to what they would have had if the earthquake hadn't occurred. We calculate that through something called synthetic control. I'm not going to go into the detail of what synthetic control is, but basically we're calculating how the economy of Kobe would have looked like without the earthquake and how it does look after the earthquake, and looking at the difference between the two. Okay? So what you observed is that actually the respondent was right and the Nobel Prize winner was wrong. The economy of Kobe didn't recover. Okay? 15% decline on average in the city. 15% is a very, very, very large decline. Right? Typically, when we're talking about a recession, we talk about maybe a 1 or 2% decline in GDP. 15% in the long term is very, very large. My conclusion from that research is, okay, Kobe not only didn't do a Build Back Better, it actually most likely is in this upper left trajectory, right? So the one trajectory you actually do not want to be in spite of the fact that they did it very quickly and they put massive amounts of resources into it from the central government. Okay? So is this Build Back Better scenario possible? Well, one place where you did see that is China after the 2008 went through an earthquake. So again, 2008, there's a big earthquake in China, very big earthquake, 80,000 people died, and massive amount of destruction in a very remote area. So in remote areas in China, there's still a lot of people, so that's why there's such a high mortality. But this area doesn't have any big cities, sort of small towns, and small towns is towns the size of Rome or something like that. So massive destruction. And what do? They decided that each municipality or each county in this area is going to be adopted by a province, by a Chinese province. So imagine Ascoli adopted by Lazio or something like that. So huge provinces are adopting each one, and they're competing which adoptee develops the best, right? That's the way they do the reconstruction. So massive amount of resources are being targeted into this area, okay? Why did the Chinese government decide to do that? Because they perceive this as a political risk, because there was a lot of discussions after the earthquake that a lot of the destruction was because of corruption, because of the way buildings were built. A lot of the buildings that were destroyed were schools. A lot of children died. This is a one-child country, so one child meaning, you know, you can imagine the heartbreak there. So the government perceives this as a political risk, so they invest massive amount of resources. The one estimate that I've seen is that for every $1 of damages, they invest $4 in the reconstruction. So massive amount of inflow of money. And then in this remote area of northern Sichuan province, they now have the best infrastructure in all of China, basically. Right? So massive investment in infrastructure, in public buildings, in residential buildings, and so forth. So maybe not so that surprisingly that you get a build back better scenario, but at a massive cost, at a massive fiscal cost, right? So clearly that, while this is an example, it's not the kind of example that is easily replicable, right? Because you can't invest $4 for every dollar of damages in any location that is hit by any kind of event, okay? So now the question comes, and I'm going to sort of demonstrate that with a little dialogue from Alice in Wonderland. Alice is asking the cat, this is the Cheshire cat, where should I go? And the cat is asking her back, well, that depends where you want to get to. Alice says, well, I don't really much care where I go to. And then the cat responds, quite obviously, then it doesn't really matter which way you go, right? And I want to claim that this is the way we have defined Build Back Better up to now. We haven't defined what we mean by better, and therefore, we can always claim that we have achieved it. Okay? For example, in Japan, they can claim they've achieved Build Back Better because they have built all the buildings back very quickly, right? So what I'm trying to do here is define a little bit better what is Build Back Better. Okay? This is a project we did with the Asian Development Bank, and basically what we argue is you want to look at Build Back Better along 4 dimensions. Okay? One is you want to build back safer. You don't want to reconstruct the same vulnerabilities, to get back to our framework. You don't want to get back the same vulnerabilities that you had before. So safer. Building back faster. So build it fast because delay has costs associated with it. And I think we see that in the case of L'Aquila. And then you want to build back more inclusively because a lot of times, and we have a lot of research on that, is that in the recovery process, there are some communities that are left behind. And inequality is becoming more acute after disasters, right? So some communities have access to resources, and those are already the communities that typically have more resources, and therefore you get a widening inequality in recovery processes. So one aspect of Build Back Better should be try to make it more inclusive, and at the very minimum, not widen inequalities. Maybe at the maximum, try to narrow them. Okay? And the last is to build back economic opportunities, because I think that's where Kobe failed. Kobe made the city more safe. Kobe made the reconstruction very fast. It actually was pretty inclusive. So, you know, Japan has a very strong social safety net, and they really try to assist the more vulnerable populations. Not completely worked out, but generally speaking, they did. But they failed to create the economic opportunities. So in the long term, yes, people had housing and so on, and everything was rebuilt, but they didn't have the jobs, right? The jobs left. The employment left the city, and because of that, their income in the long term has declined, right? And we're talking about long term, we're talking about 20 years later, right? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit in what time I have left, hopefully I have some time left, is a bit about these four 4 things: safer, faster, inclusive, and with opportunities. Okay? So if we're talking about safer, I already said that our framework, our usual framework, is the risk is an intersection of exposure, vulnerability, and the hazard. If we want to make it safer, all we have to do is either reduce exposure or reduce vulnerability. If we manage to reduce exposure through moving people away out of harm's way, or if we manage to reduce vulnerability by, for example, better construction standards, then we can reduce the risk, right? We can't affect the hazard. We can't prevent the earth from moving in earthquakes and so forth. But we can do something about exposure and vulnerability. I'm going to give you 2 sort of opposite examples here to sort of talk about the trade-offs a bit. On the left is the map of the city of Christchurch in New Zealand, where I have lived up until a week ago. Christchurch had a very big earthquake in 2011. About 185 people died. The city basically got destroyed. Okay, all the center of the city was completely damaged, and pretty much every single house in the city. It's a city of 400,000 people. Pretty much every single house in the city had some damage to it. So quite an extensive damage. Christchurch is the 2nd biggest city in New Zealand. And what they did there, the government, is they decided that some areas are too risky, and then they decided to reduce exposure, to move people out of harm's way. Okay? They're too risky because of the risk of liquefaction. And they moved 8,000 houses, 8,000 families to different locations. So that's a very big program of permanently relocating groups of people. It's actually the biggest, what we call managed retreat. In the climate change space, we call those managed retreat. It's the biggest managed retreat program in a democratic country. Okay? Elsewhere, you see big managed retreat programs, like China does managed retreat program by just, knocking on the door of 1 million people and telling them you have 24 hours to clear your house. In a democratic country, it's very unusual to do managed retreats that are much bigger than few houses or maybe a few dozen houses. In this case, 8,000 houses, voluntary program, 98% take-up rate, so very impressively successful program. I can talk about this program a lot more, but this is unusual. That's the point I want to emphasize. So it's unusual to do this kind of making a build back safer process through managed retreat. The other example is from the city of Concepcion in Chile. So if you look at this area here, okay, that's a very low-lying neighborhood that is surrounded by three sides by water. The bay is here. In the 2010 earthquake in Chile, this is again a big earthquake in Chile. Concepcion is the 2nd biggest city in Chile. They had a tsunami. Tsunami came from the bay here and basically destroyed all this neighborhood. Now, if you did a Build Back Safer program, you would not rebuild this neighborhood, because this neighborhood is impossible to evacuate during a tsunami because it's surrounded by water and the high ground is very far away. So it's very easy to evacuate this area, for example, because it's just next to a hill. I took the picture from the hill. But it's impossible to evacuate this area. So you just wouldn't build there. But the government of Chile decided we want to build really, really fast. We want to do a really fast rebuild, like in Japan. And they decided everyone who had a plot of land and then had a house on it, this is a poor neighborhood, we will just give them enough money to build exactly the same house on that plot of land, and that's it. We don't have to deal with finding other land, negotiating, buying the land at what price, and so on. So there's a whole process that takes a long time. took a very long time in Christchurch, took about 6 or 7 years in Christchurch. So they said, we'll just rebuild everything as it was before. So they've rebuilt exactly the same vulnerability in that neighborhood that was there before. They've just rebuilt it. Okay? So yes, the rebuild was fast, maybe even with economic opportunity, but it wasn't safer. Okay? So you can see these trade-offs. The other option, if you don't want to reduce exposure by moving people out of harm's way, is reduce vulnerability. So build better, right? Build better buildings, build better infrastructure, and so on. That's also not that easy. For various reasons, it's costly. So you always have pushback. It's in many countries, it's hard to enforce rules. This is a picture from the Turkey earthquake, where there's been a lot of criticism, actually a lot of new buildings that failed. So it's not a lot of the old buildings that failed, a lot of new buildings failed, apparently because the buildings codes were not properly enforced in that region for various reasons, maybe poverty, maybe corruption, maybe also it's a conflict region, so there's a conflict there with the Kurds. So various reasons, but the fact is vulnerability was not reduced even though building codes were much improved in Turkey in the past 20 years since the 99 earthquake. So they improved the building codes, but then they had the earthquake earlier this year, and a lot of the new buildings built with the new building code still failed. So that's one reason why reducing vulnerability through better building codes is difficult. There are other reasons. Reason that is very prominent in Italy, of course, you have a large stock of existing buildings that are unsafe. And what do you do with existing buildings? Typically, to strengthen them or reduce vulnerability in them would entail very, very large costs. Then you need to start thinking about prioritizing and which buildings, and it begins to be, once you start thinking about it, it begins to be a very big headache. I'm part of a project that tries to do the same thing in the city I'm from, in Wellington, but it's a very complicated decision-making process on how to do that. So it's not an easy task at all. Another sort of so if building safer is complicated because reducing exposure or vulnerability is complicated, which is why we don't see that much of it, how about building back faster? So in principle, what's so problematic in building fast in a rich country like Italy or Japan, or why not do it fast, right? Why does it take so long to rebuild the city of L'Aquila? There are complicated reasons for that, I'm sure, and I don't know them because I'm not from L'Aquila and I haven't followed this. But there are a lot of trade-offs, right? So if you want, for example, if you want an inclusive build-back better process, that means you need to consult and you need to talk to the communities and you need to understand what they need. That process takes time, right? So that delays. So you have a trade-off between fast and inclusive, right? You also have a trade-off, and we already mentioned that. Okay. That's like God was speaking to me. You also have a trade-off between fast and safe. We've seen that in the case of Christchurch, right? They decided to emphasize safety and move these 8,000 houses out of harm's way. It took a long time to do that. Okay, so again, Christchurch, like L'Aquila, the process of reconstruction, Christchurch had their earthquake in 2011, so only 2 years after L'Aquila, that process of reconstruction is still ongoing there as well. Okay, partly because they're trying to do a very inclusive and deliberate process and also make the city safer, right? So again, you see this trade-off between fast and these other dimensions. Inclusive, well, we want inclusive. I put a picture of Karl Marx for only one reason, and that is I'm related to him. So I feel an obligation whenever I talk about inequality to, he's my ancestor, so I need to acknowledge that. But the point is, of course, that's a very big concern, right? So we have a lot of research at almost any scale, from the country to the individual household, that in the process of recovery, you will have these communities that are more vulnerable and more disadvantaged, and they will typically be left behind, okay? And we have evidence on that from, villages in the state of Tamil Nadu in India after the tsunami, and we have evidence on that from Fiji and Samoa in the Pacific Ocean after big tropical cyclones. We have evidence on that from New Orleans in the US after the Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I have evidence on that from Christchurch. So we have plenty of evidence that recovery processes are typically fail on the inclusivity dimension, okay? And even in the case of Japan, where there is a much better social safety net, much better community awareness, even there, I can give you examples of where that process has failed in terms of inclusivity. A lot of times, what happens is people say this is a second-order issue, right? We have our priorities is to get the recovery fast and to rebuild everything, and maybe even if we are if they're really sort of forward-looking, it's about economic opportunities and make sure that there are economic opportunities. And that issue of inequality is sort of, we'll deal with that later. But of course, once inequality widens, it becomes a self-reinforcing process. So it becomes more and more difficult to deal with it. And I think that is a dimension in which recoveries almost always fail. In that building back better process. Economic opportunities. We know that with economic opportunities, by far the biggest driver of the economic opportunities that the recovery processes builds is how much resources are being directed to the affected region. So I gave you the example of China, where every dollar of damage had $4 of investment in the region. That clearly creates its own economic opportunities. But there are all these trade-offs between economic opportunities and safety and speed and inclusivity, right? All these other dimensions. So there's a clear trade. There's a clear issue. There's clear positive correlation with speed. The faster you manage to recover, the better the economic recovery will be in terms of economic opportunities, because you are less likely to lose the existing economic engines in the city. If the recovery takes a long time, then some of the economic engines of a city or a region or whatever will drift away, will move away, right? That's what happened to some extent in Kobe, even though they did do it fast. There is economic opportunity, and if safety is delaying, is slowing down the recovery, then there is a negative correlation in a sense between safety and economic opportunity. And likewise, there might be connections between the question of inclusivity and the question of economic opportunity. But here I think it's more nuanced, because it depends on what kind of economic opportunities. So in affected regions, what kind of industries it had before, what kind of employment it had before, and what those means for inclusivity. So in terms of, in Japan, for example, what happened in Kobe after the Kobe earthquake, they had a lot of employment in the petrochemical industry, which was pretty high-paying jobs, pretty high-paying industrial jobs. Those big companies left, and the kind of jobs that emerged were service jobs, retail, and things like that. And those had typically lower wages, right? So that's the explanation of the average low wage, but also larger dispersion now, larger inequality in the city of Kobe because of that loss of the high-paying jobs and the emergence of just low-paying jobs to replace them, right? So you can have all these nuanced connections between those 4 dimensions that you're striving for, and that's and it's important, right? So it's important if you want to do Build Back Better and you're using the slogan, you need to define it and you need to very carefully think about all these trade-offs, because you want to make sure you try to minimize the adverse trade-offs and possibly use the synergies that you can, example, get from speedy recovery with economic opportunities and so forth, right? This is just putting this in, since Massimo was in the COP, I should mention that all of this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue because climate change is making the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events higher, right? This is true globally. It's true for flooding almost everywhere. It's definitely true it's true for droughts in some locations, and it's definitely true for storms, right? Storms are becoming more intense everywhere. Storms are going to dump more rain everywhere. So we see an increase in pluvial floods, we see an increase in fluvial floods, and we see increase in droughts in many, many locations around the world, which means that this question of how do we build back better becomes more and more important with climate change, right? And, you know, sort of the penguin is us with climate change. Why I'm saying that? The first paper on climate change was this one. It was written in 1896, right? So that's the first paper that sort of clearly outlines the problem that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and if we emit more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, then we'll get warming of the planet, right? 1896, it took us a long time to take the problem seriously. At the time, of course, we didn't hardly use any carbon fuel, so we didn't emit almost any carbon. So we already understood the problem before we made it, before we actually created it. We still managed to create it quite successfully. And only now, only in, I think, the recent decade have we started to think about the problem more seriously. Even though there was a very big report about climate change in the 1930s, there was another big report on climate change in the 1960s, and then another one in the 1970s, and then we start having the IPCC reports at the end of the early 1990s, which I'm guessing is before all of you were born. And still, only now we're suddenly, oh no, there is climate change and we need to do something about it. But I'm interested not more generally in the question of climate change, but the question of climate change and extreme weather events and how we need to think about the process of reconstruction after extreme weather events more I think, systematically than we do now. We also need to try to prevent them through emission reduction and so forth, but that's not my focus. Yes. Why is this not? Okay, I think I'm done. And I'm happy to take questions or debates or arguments or, I don't know, whatever. First of all, about climate change denial. I always, whenever I give a talk about climate change, I give quite a lot of talks about climate change. In the last few years, I haven't had much, so I used to have a lot of denial questions from the audience. These have been disappearing. I hope that once I move to Italy, they're not going to re-emerge from audiences. The science is overwhelming, of course, so there's no real issue. There is still debates you see among denialists now, not so much about whether it's real or not, but how urgent it is, okay? And do we need to actually spend a huge amount of resources now for something that is in the future. So part of my work, I've looked at extreme weather events right now and how those extreme weather events have become more frequent and more intense already now, not in some future that we don't care about, because frankly politicians don't care about the future. They only care about the next election. But the problem is now, it's not a future problem, right? So recently we published a paper which said that, you know, we quantified how much the global cost of these extreme, the climate change top-up to those extreme weather events is right now. So in the past 20 years, our calculation was it about $140 billion per year because of climate change from extreme weather events. So a very significant cost right now rather than the future. And I think the political system understands the present more than it understands the risks in the future. So I think in that sense, that kind of quantification is a bit of a more powerful argument on why we should take this seriously now. And we see extreme, I mean, you've seen these heat waves in Italy that you've never seen before, right? And you saw the floods in Germany a couple of years ago that killed almost 200 people. And you see the heat wave in the UK where they had more than 40 degrees. And all of our systems are not geared to deal with those things. It's clearly something is going on. But once we quantify that, I think the political system is more likely to do something about it, because they understand it's not a future problem, it's a present problem. The other comment I have is about, there is sort of a saying that disasters speed up processes that will anyway happen, right? So if a region in Italy is losing population, then a disaster in that region will speed up the process of population loss. It doesn't really, a lot of times, it doesn't create it, it just speeds it up, okay? And then it begins to be a conversation about, okay, is that a problem? Do we need to do something about it? Are we concerned about, you know, population losses and people are moving to the cities and people are moving to the coasts, which is something you see everywhere in Italy as well, but everywhere people are moving to big cities and moving to coasts, right? So you see these countryside, smaller towns, villages and so on emptying up. It's not unique to Italy at all. Are we concerned about that, and why are we concerned about that? And once we've defined why we are concerned about that, then maybe we can fix the why, right? And in some cases, we may decide that it's fine if that process is happening. We just need to make sure that whoever is experiencing the process is experiencing it in the least harmful way. I'm going to give you an example of another piece of research I've done in Hawaii. So Hawaii, one of the islands in Hawaii was hit by a big hurricane in 1992, and a lot of the population left that island because of that and never came back. Okay? Now, is that a problem? Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask the people who stayed, they're happy. There are fewer people on the island. It's more quiet. It's a very beautiful island. They enjoy the quiet, right? But of course, if you ask the people who left and were forced out because there were no jobs and they couldn't sustain themselves in there, and they still, you know, their origins are there, their roots are there, they feel very differently about it. So we need to sort of think more carefully about who cares about it, why do they care about it, how we can deal with that. So I think it requires very nuanced conversations about the aim of policy, basically. The one last comment is sort of this, you're saying you're spending more on economics and social recovery. So typically when governments do it, they spend on the economic and not on the social so much, right? It's easier to do, it's easier to conceive, it's also, treasuries are usually dominating in most governments, the priority. So there's more emphasis on economic reconstruction, but less on social reconstruction. But I don't think you can actually separate the two. So you can't build a thriving economy without a strong social structure, and vice versa. And I think, at least from my observations, tend to be too much emphasis on the economic dimension and not enough emphasis on the social aspect. I don't know how it is in Italy, but that has been sort of my observations from elsewhere, and that's something, again, as academics and so on, we need to push against and say the two needs to go together, right? I don't think you can develop a thriving society without a strong economic base at all, but you need the two. So to make sure that is being considered by policymakers is not always easy. Yeah, that's my comments about it. Yeah, so my point in identifying the trade-offs is not that they're inevitable. It's once you recognize them, then you can try and prevent a lot of these trade-offs. So you understand that there is a trade-off between safety and speed, for example, right? So moving people out of harm's way takes a long time if you have to negotiate it after a disaster. So, but there are ways to deal with that. You put a program in place that is already ready with a mechanism for managed retreat before the disaster. So when you don't need to do all these negotiations after the fact because you already have a framework in place. It's very difficult to get that. So I was part of in New Zealand, I was part of an expert group who was trying to suggest to the government, here is a law that will do managed retreat, and if there is an event, then you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and everyone knows exactly what are the legal questions and how they are resolved, and what are the economic questions, and who gets compensated for what, and how much, and all of these are settled in law, so that we have that sort of, I would call it post-disaster managed retreat law. Okay? And then you cut that trade-off, right? So you can do both fast and safe. Okay? And that's just an example. We failed. The government didn't take us up on this, and then now there's a new government. They just voted in a new government, which is even more antagonistic to this idea. So, but in principle, you can change those trade-offs. That's my point. Okay, and you can design ways to ameliorate all these risks of trade-offs, and then try to achieve all four dimensions at the same time. Yeah, that's exactly should be the aim of policy and recovery processes, to achieve all four dimensions. It's not easy, and a lot of it needs to be established ahead of time before a disaster event. But it is we need stronger frameworks for that, and I don't think any country has quite nailed it. So I don't have an example of a recovery process that has quite nailed it and did this on all four dimensions. But I don't think it's impossible. I don't know the circumstances in Italy, right? So I wouldn't be able. But I can give you sort of a short example from Japan. So Japan, after the Kobe earthquake, the government decided, okay, we are going to rebuild housing for everyone, or pretty much everyone. So anyone below a certain threshold of income and their house was damaged, was provided with a new house. They had no insurance, so there was very little insurance. But they allocated those houses by lottery. So that meant that they completely broke apart communities, because one building, then one family got housed in that part of the city, and one family got, and they completely broke up the social ties that are very, very important. And there's a lot of research on social capital and the importance of social capital and so forth. Yeah, and they completely dismantle that by taking a fair process, which means you get it by lottery, so that's perceived to be a fair. And then they realized that was a mistake. They realized it, especially because they had a bunch of what they called lonely deaths. older people who used to live in Japan is a very aging society with a lot of very old people, right? And old people who used to live in, say, an apartment building, but where all their neighbors knew them and took care of them and helped them, get to the doctor and all of that stuff. And suddenly they're stuck in another part of the city where no one knows them. So they had a bunch of these people die, basically, because of neglect. And they realized this is a mistake. So after the tsunami in 2011, they relocated neighborhoods, not individuals, right? So you can deal with that. That's an example of how you deal with the trade-off. You still do a fast process and one that is considered to be fair, but you don't break out up the social ties that are important for inclusive outcomes, right? So that process was much more successful after the 2011 tsunami than it was after the 1995 Kobe earthquake. So it's again an example where there are trade-offs, but you can design programs that will deal with those trade-offs and reduce them if there are adverse trade-offs. If there are, of course, complementarities that are, working for you, then that's great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if there is someone else who want to ask a question. Otherwise, I would like to pose one to our guest. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your speech. I am a researcher within this READY consortium mentioned by Marco Modica, reducing risks of natural disasters. And I'm a planner, like Professor Sargolini and Ilenia Pierantoni. So I'm not an economist. Despite of that, I wish to follow you a little bit in your field and ask you this. From the last two answers you gave to Marco's question and the last one, I got the idea that you are positively thinking about the possibility of actually really building back better. If we define what is building back better and do not go randomly like in the building back in Wonderland example you mentioned. But actually from all your presentation, all your speech, I mean, it seems to me that all your speech today was proving once more the fallacy of the broken window by Frédéric Bastiat, by means of which, just very shortly for those who are not familiar with this story or parable, each destruction, each disaster, each broken window is actually a failure and a damage to the society, because the costs in the end exceed by far the possible benefits. So there is no way, in a sense, to exploit the crisis as an opportunity, a little bit more negative. So, because you said what I understood is that with the due exceptions, for instance, the one in Christchurch in New Zealand, it's very difficult, actually, if not impossible, to apply this paradigm of building back better. So my question in the end is this: if I interpreted correctly your speech, and if it's not maybe the time right now, in the light of this, to shift, to move, maybe really now maybe I say a blasphemy, but to forget this building back better paradigm and just to focus more on building better. Or maybe I would rephrase this intention, this expression in a way like changing for the better. So focusing more, stressing more the fact that maybe it's better in the end and we can manage a retreat in times of peace, like we can act, we can prevent a disaster from happening, and not just thinking after the occurrence of disaster how to build back better, because this building back better paradigm in the end, it seems to me that is quite still conservative point of view approach. Maybe we should really try to maybe it's not a utopia to manage retreat in times of peace. I don't know what you think. Thank you.
Two comments. First of all, I agree with you that prevention is better, and if we could, no one is gaining from this. We are better off if we had no disasters. there's no question about that. But I would argue that disasters are here, and we are not able to prevent them. We definitely need to invest more in prevention, and nothing in my talk seems to suggest that I don't believe we need to invest in prevention. But it's not going to be enough, and we will have disasters, and we still need to think about how to recover after them. Okay? And I'm going to give you this is where I a bit disagree with the argument, and that is the climate change space. So for a very long time, climate activists have said, let's not talk about impacts and adaptation. Let's just talk about mitigation, how to reduce greenhouse gases. Because if we start to talking about adapting to the consequences of climate change, we will weaken the incentive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? And I strongly objected to that because I thought we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can both mitigate and deal with the impacts. We have to deal with the impacts because they are there. We're putting our head in the sand if we say, no, we just reduce greenhouse gases. Because the impacts are there and they're already experienced by very vulnerable populations in various places. So we need to both do spend on mitigation, on reducing greenhouse gases, which in the disaster space is called prevention, right? In the climate change space is called mitigation. And we also need to deal with the impacts. And finally in this COP, the COP that now is happening in Dubai, they finally instituted the Loss and Damage Fund, which will start to deal with those impacts. But it took them 20 years, and the opposition to the Loss and Damage Fund came from the denialists, but also from all these people who said, no, we should be spending on mitigation. We shouldn't be worried about loss and damage. We should be spending on mitigation. So I think we need to do both. Nothing in what I've spoken about seems to, I didn't want to suggest that we shouldn't, how did you say it? Build better. Yeah, we should build better, of course. But we also need to build back better. Because, we'll still have events, we'll still have earthquakes, we'll still have floods, we'll have more floods, and so forth. And so we need to concentrate on those things. And yes, build back better is hard to achieve. And in the many cases that I've sort of suggested today, maybe they have achieved it on 1 or 2 dimensions, but not all 4 of them, and frequently there were trade-offs there. But with better design of policy, we can do that, and we should. And it's in sometimes, and this is, I'm going to get into a bit of trouble if some people don't like what I say here. Sometimes these disasters are an opportunity to change things that without a disaster is very difficult to change. I'm going to give you an example on this managed retreat. In principle, it's sometimes much wiser to move people out of harm's way before there's anything, before there is an event. But it's very, very, very difficult to convince people to move away if an event hasn't happened. It's much more easy to convince them to move away if an event happens and the risk is now salient to them. They understand that this is not sustainable. And then that's why Christchurch managed to move 8,000 families voluntarily from their homes. Some of them lived there for 50, 60, 70 years because they saw the risk. They just happened to them. Trying to move those 8,000 families without risk, without that risk eventuating, becoming salient, becoming present, would have been impossible. So in some sense, yes, prevention in principle is better, but sometimes it's easier to make sure that the recovery is better, and that as long as lives are not lost, if the damage is, to assets and things like that, this is all replaceable. Lives are not replaceable, but buildings and infrastructure and so on are. So if we manage to make sure that our disasters don't kill, and we manage to have recovery processes that are efficient, we are sort of moving in the right direction. But again, I'm not trying to argue that prevention is not something we should be thinking about as well. Yeah, so there is a question of saliency. So there's a very good book called Ostrich Paradox about all these behavioral failures in why we are underspending on prevention. And some of those we just need to accept and say, okay, this is the way people think, therefore we live in that framework. How can we make sure we create better incentives for prevention and at least reduce life risks so that recovery is better, and then deal with the recovery and do it in a built back better way along these four dimensions. So we need to be realistic that yes, and we have political systems that are designed for the short term, they're not designed for long-term considerations. I mean, both democracies and autocracies are sort of short-termists. But people are short-termist as well, and we have hyperbolic discounting and all of that stuff that creates that short-termism. And risks are not salient, and we are amnesiac, and we are myopic, and all of these things are there, and we need to accept. Some of them we need to accept. Some of them we need to create incentives that we counter those issues. Yeah.
I thank you again for this contribution, which, just a few words, it's perfectly in line with the topics. This is a school of architecture and design. So we have courses where we are trying to support to impact on the quality of living environments and cities in the planning, into the building envelope and the building design, but also into design of objects that can help people to live better, you know? So we have, as architects and planners, we have a role also in the quality of life of people, and all of these are somehow in all of our classes and courses. So I hope that today the students will also have an impact about somehow the economics, that in this school we don't talk a lot about economics, but it is important to have also these, ideas about how important climate change, disasters, and everything are also in people's lives, what we do for people here. So thank you very much again for being here, and another thanks.